How can a narcissist parent emotionally harm his child forever? I read this article, which I'll share with you, but it felt funny because as I was reading it, it felt as if they were talking a little bit about me. And I want to share it with you. Like any narcissist father does, he always wants to be the good time dad. He's not the parent who's there when you get sick, or when you misbehave, or when you need help. Welcome to Radio Labio's English program, where I share the most interesting notes of the day that you may not have had time to catch up on. I'm Juan Andres. I podcast in English and Spanish to ensure that all Latinos can have access to our programs regardless of what language they speak, and thank you very much for listening. More of the article that I was reading, and I'll also be sharing with you my life story, because this is as if they're writing about me in a way, reminding me of so many things, and I feel that I need to come out of the closet. And I don't mean the closet as a child you lock yourself up in a safe place, and you don't realize it, but it's internal, it's mental. You don't physically lock yourself into a closet, but you are, in a way, doing it mentally. And here I am, a senior with a wonderful family, and I'm still dealing with issues about my parents. And I've never talked about it to anybody. And I think it's about time that I just let it out. So I'm calling it getting out of the closet. But I want to share with you the article that I read that made me come to this conclusion. Mom does all the boring, regular stuff. Dad is a fun parent. But they will also badmouth each other. They will tell us kids complete lies because they want the kids to love them. This gives my dad control, something all narcissists need. To both my parents, their children were merely an extension of themselves and not individual beings. Whomever is their scapegoat child, that child will be beaten and traumatized severely. They will be blamed for everything. The other child, the golden child or the favorite child, will get the lion's share of attention. They can never do wrong. However, this child feels immense pressure to never fail. They are the ones who grow up to be the next generation of narcissists. The other kid or kids are usually ignored to a large degree. They can grow up to be narcissists or empaths. They're often promised things which the father never gives them. It is the mother who must explain why dad didn't show up for the kids or give them Christmas parents in the dad's name. You end up having some pretty emotionally damaged kids, as we were, any way you look at it. It's a longer story, but I encapsulated it to give you an idea of the desperation this particular person was going through, remembering their childhood, and it brought so many memories back about mine. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Latin America. And my parents were, I would say, now as I look back, they were probably considered upper middle class. But I can never remember me being part of their lives. I mean, they were there for a short period of time because they got divorced. But I'll go back as far as my memory can take me, and I'll give you an idea of the frustrations and fears and difficult situations I went through as a child. The furthest back I can remember is that I would wake up in the morning and they would have a maid, a babysitter technically, that would wake me up in the morning and clothe me, shower me. But before that, the first thing she'd do when I got out of bed was she'd grab a bedpan in her arm and hug it with her left arm, and then sit me on it against her chest and hold me with her right arm as she walked up and down until I went to the bathroom. So even to this day, that's the first thing I do when I get up in the morning, because that's the way, or that's what happened to me from the day I was born, that I could remember, that my memory could go back. I remember this person, this babysitter. I remember her face. I remember the birthmark she used to have on our cheek. I can see her features. The rest of her is sort of blurry, but the face, it's like I saw her yesterday. The next thing I remember is that I was a toddler and I was walking towards a table, and I was attracted by the lamp. And I wanted to touch it because it was bright. And when I extended my arm, my mother was sitting there, my father wasn't there. And she slapped me real hard, my right hand. And I started crying. It was a traumatic moment. Even to this day, I can remember that. Unforgettable. Because she could have easily taken my hand and said, no, that's hot and it's going to burn you. No, it was an automatic reaction of hitting me. My parents, for as long as I can remember, were there for me financially. I never needed clothing or food, but I could never get any of their time that I can ever remember. I can't remember the day that we went out as a family to a restaurant, even as a kid, even as a teenager. Never. They were always doing something socially or going somewhere and doing things that made them happy. When they decided it was time for me to start going to school, they put me in a kindergarten. I don't even think that they bothered to interview the teacher, or it was sort of a day. They called it a kindergarten, but it was, as I look back in today's terms, I would call it a daycare or preschool. That's what I would have called it. But back then, and in the country I was born in, it was called a kindergarten. I remember the first day that I sat there, scared because I'd never been away. All I knew was this maid that would wake me up in the morning and sit me on the bedchamber while she carried me around. And then all of a sudden, I'm sitting in this classroom and I'm looking at all these kids, and I was an only child, and I never played with anybody. And here I am now, 4, 5 years, 6 years old, and I don't know how to play. I know how to play by myself, but I don't know how to play with anyone else. And I'm scared. And I'm fidgety. And it's difficult for me to concentrate and pay attention. So as the day goes by, the teacher gets upset because I wasn't paying attention. I was distracted. So she decided that what she was going to do was punish me. And that would help me. I choke up when I think about this. And that would help me concentrate. So she grabbed me by my little arm and opened the closet door and put me in the closet and locked the door. And here the room was as dark as night. There was a light bulb on the ceiling, but I couldn't reach it. It was one of those light bulbs in the middle of the ceiling, and it had a string or chain hanging down, and you'd have to pull on it. But I was a little kid. I couldn't reach it. So here I was in the middle of this room. I was afraid to open my mouth because she might leave me in there forever. So I kept very, 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 very quiet, and I stood in the middle of the room, frightened out of my wits. And I look down and I see something moving. And as my eyes start getting used to the dark, I see that there's 2 or 3 things moving. And I finally realize there were mice or rats. I don't know. I was so scared I couldn't tell. I don't know if they were small or big, but they were either mice or rats. And I froze and didn't move for a moment and just stood there for as long as I can ever remember. And I don't know when she opened the door, but by the time she let me out, it was almost time to go home. My mother worked about 3-4 blocks from there. She didn't come to pick me up. So at 5 or 6, I basically walked out and walked all the way to my mother's. She had a beauty salon at the time. And I walked in. My eyes were teary, and she said, "What's wrong?" And I told her the story about me being locked up and that things were crawling on the floor. And she grabbed me by my hand and pulled me and walked out of the business and went back to the kindergarten or preschool and made a big fuss with the teacher and opened the closet and turned on the light and started screaming and yelling and saying, "I'm never bringing my child back." And then I went back with her as she tugged me back to the business, and she sat me in a corner till she finished her work for the day, and we went home. By then, my grandmother was in my life. She was slowly becoming my mother, because my mother was only at that point there when she needed to do something, move my body or buy me food or buy me clothes. In all my life, I'd never remember her or my father sitting down and doing homework with me. I never remember them having a teacher conference or attending one. I never ever remember, other than the time it took them to matriculate me or sign me into a new school, that they ever returned or stepped in the buildings where I was being educated. My grandmother was elderly. She was a senior at that point, in her 60s. I had a very difficult life. It was very moody, very loving, but very temperamental. It took very little for her to lose her temper, and everything she would resolve with a belt. So I never saw my mother, I never saw my father except when they would walk in and go to sleep They were always socializing after work, going to parties and doing things, never taking me. And my grandmother was getting adjusted to dealing with this child that she thought she had already finished rearing children. So she was frustrated. I didn't know it then, but as I look back and understand, now I understand why she was the way she was with me. Anyway, after taking me out of that kindergarten, my mother all of a sudden realized that, got this brilliant idea to put me in an American school. No longer a Spanish-speaking school, but an American school in my country. And she accomplished it. But the only problem was that there were only Americans in that school and they didn't look like me. So from the first day I sat down in kindergarten, because I had to start, I never did kindergarten at that other place where they locked me up. And this was now really kindergarten at this point, sitting at a desk. No one would talk to me. No one would come around me. Everybody'd make fun of me. They would push me. They'd all go play and get together at recess and totally ignore that I even exist. I'd approach them and they'd walk away. The teachers wouldn't get involved because to them I was a stranger. I didn't look like any other student in the school. The bullying got so difficult that I didn't want to go to school. So my mother all of a sudden talks to my father and they get the brilliant idea, we'll move him to another American school about 5 miles away. This one's a bad one. We're going to put him in a good one. They never bothered checking that school either. They just put me in there. The only thing, it was a duplicate of the same thing that I was suffering with the other one. But at this point I kept quiet because I didn't know where they were going to put me next. So I figured, I got to make the best of this. As a little kid, I didn't want any more problems. Too many changes. It was very confusing. I lasted in that school from 1st grade to 7th grade. And it was a miserable time. Even at lunchtime, where we had to walk to buy lunch at a local clubhouse, all the kids would walk together and they'd sit together at tables and I'd have to go get my meal and sit alone because every time I'd come near a table, they would stare at me. And if there was an empty chair, they'd put something on the chair and say, it's busy. So I'd always walk to a separate table by myself to eat my lunch. So now at this point, I'm about 12 years old. So in those first 7, 8 years, formative years of my life, I was raised by I'm being generous with that word because they didn't raise me. My grandmother, my frustrated, upset grandmother that had the responsibility, who loved me, she loved me, God bless her, she saved my life. I look back now and say, even with all her bad temper and all the spankings, if I wouldn't have had her in my life would have been a disaster. She centered me. She gave me a reason. Even if it's to misbehave, she gave me a reason. In all the years until my parents passed away, I never remember my father ever hugging me. I never remember my father giving me a kiss on the cheek or the forehead. And now that I think of it, I never remember my mother ever doing that either. They would just come in and get dressed and go to parties. That's all I can remember about them. Get dressed and go to parties. That experience was devastating as I grew up because I had to start adjusting. I had to start learning how to deal with the world around me. I had no one to tell me how to grow up. And if I had questions, I had to answer them by myself. I didn't have any role model. I couldn't sit down and, like a kid, say, "Daddy, this happened to me," and he'd give me advice. Never. And my mother, much less. Just too busy socializing. By the 7th grade, they decided that I was misbehaving because they wanted to resolve everything by punishment. Punishment, 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 punishment. There wasn't any love. So there was nothing to look forward for. You know, as a kid, you behave because you never want to jeopardize the love that your parents give you. That warmth, that feeling of belonging, that closeness, that need, that connection is so important that you want to please them. I didn't have that. So I rebelled for attention. As I look back, they called me mischievous, they called me energetic, they called me all kinds of names. Never took any responsibility for them being the cause of what I was going through. And resolving it by punishing. Never taking the responsibility upon themselves to try to look for help or try to find a way to connect with me. So the little attention I got by misbehaving. I wasn't a bad kid. I didn't steal. I didn't hurt other people. I just was disobedient. And especially if they punished me and I didn't think it was fair. They'd lock me up in the bedroom. And I'd open the window of the bedroom and jump out on top of the garage or carport ceiling, and then from there jump on the grass below and run away on my bike. And then I'd have to come home and get spanked. And I was living through this experience when they decided that they couldn't deal with us anymore. I was a bad child. So they decided to send me to the United States and put me in a military academy so they could straighten me out. That was their solution to what they called my problem. I'm going to stop there because when I got here, the first thing I decided to do is I don't care what happens, I will never go back and live in the country that I was born in, because all it was just a series of bad memories. That I would stay here. So that was like a new leaf, but it was also an incredibly scary adventure. Horrific adventure of tears and crying and fear of being in a foreign country, locked up in a military institute, dressed in a uniform, marching, and if you didn't eat properly, you'd get swats. They had a big paddle And then there was always a little kid that had a bigger rank. He had more stripes, or he had little buttons on his shoulder. And he would sit at the table, and every time you did something that he didn't like, he'd put down a little mark. And each mark meant a swat. Never told you why. And then at the end of dinner, everybody that got these little marks, they'd hand them in as they'd walk out of the dining room to the Catholic sister standing there. And then she'd collect these little papers and call us out, and we'd have to stand in line, one behind the other. And for each mark, there was a sergeant, retired sergeant from the Army, who would get the paddle and give us a whack for each one. Narcissistic parents are extremely, extremely damaging to children. My heart goes out to the person that wrote this story that made me remember my experience. My kids were raised differently. This is my second marriage. My first marriage, I was toddling between making sure that I never did the things my parents did to me, and yet still doing some of the things that they did because I didn't know any other way. So here I was with this struggle and battle of raising my now adult children. And when I look back now with everything I've learned, and I've had to learn along the way, making a lot of mistakes, I look back and I go, my goodness, I did better than my parents did with me, but I didn't do anywhere as near as what I needed to do to bring up my adult children as I would think that they deserved to be raised, with love and closeness, unity and family. Now in my second marriage, I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I've learned, I've educated myself, I've gone to classes, parenting, psychotherapy, a lot of things in the decades and decades I've been alive. And I have to say that at this point now, I'm calling myself what I consider to be as good of a parent as I'm capable of being in this lifetime. I'm sure not perfect, but gosh, what a difference from where I was and from where I was raised and the way I raised my first children to where I am now. It seems like 20 lifetimes away. All I can say to parents is love your children. Love them forever. Those first 7 to 10 years of their lives, make sure you're there for them at every step of the way. Help them in school. Be with them. You're not going to have them your entire life. They're going to eventually have families of their own, and you want them to learn from you how to treat their children with tenderness, closeness, love, family, unity, dedication, friendship, commitment, all those so valuable things that I didn't even know existed when I was a child. Don't lose the opportunity, because if you're going to live 80 years, what the heck is 18 to 20 years to dedicate to your kids? So when they decide to go out in the world on their own and start experimenting and making mistakes on their own, they can count on you being there in case they need to ask you a question, in case they need to say, hey, Dad, this just happened to me. What do you think? I never had that. And that's so important. So important. Even after the children are independent with their own families. It's so important. I'm Juan Andres. You can find us on more than 60 sites on the internet where you can listen to our podcast. Just ask Google Radio Labio and bingo, will show up a number of selections of sites where you can access our programs. On my behalf, as well as my colleague Ivan Encinas, and our manager and fellow on-air personality Francisco Maldonado, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.